So now let's take a look at extracting transactional data from a tabular file. Now this animation is actually relevant for both CSV and database connections, even though the initial opening of the data source is a bit different depending what type you have. The actual data viewer and the rest is exactly the same. So here we'll use a CSV file, but the only difference with the database is that you have to connect to it with the proper credentials first. Now, when you have transactional tabular data, the first thing that's important to do is to define the boundaries. So define how many rows or how many lines inside of your data source refer to a specific record. Here, what we know is that the invoice number will always change between each of our source record. So all we need to do is to change the trigger in the boundary to change on invoice number. So here what we have is a variable number of rows between each of the source records. So if I switch to the second record, you'll see that we have a different number of lines. So obviously we're not going to do a static extraction of each of those lines. We're going to need to add a loop to our extraction. But first we need to extract the promotional information in the same way that we do in the other CSV. So let me select all the information that does not change from line to line. We'll only extract it once. There's also a couple of fields at the end of the line, so we'll go and get that too. And now we're ready to extract the transactional information, which is all the fields here that aren't in blue. So all the fields that change on all the rows, this is what we need to put in what we call the detail table. So the detail table will contain a number of entries that is equivalent to the number of rows in the source record. We start by simply adding the loop. Because this is a CSV file, we only need to go through each line, so the loop is pretty simple. And then within that loop, we extract the lines that we want. So as we can see, the extraction is fairly simple. We have our static or record data, and then we have the detail table, and we can switch between the detail lines to make sure that the extraction works properly for all these lines. Now, tabular data is generally very stable in the sense that you won't have different types of data depending on the line. This may happen in very weird data samples, but we're not going to cover it because it's not standard. Normally, every line has the same fields. Now let's go through the process really quickly. We start by extracting the data on the first line, all the data that doesn't change. Why on the first line? Well, because we want the extraction to only happen once, and we want it to happen as soon as possible. And again, the smaller number of steps that we have, the more optimized our process is. So we extract on the first line, and then we loop for each row in the source record. And for each of those lines, we extract all the data that is variable on each line, and then we finish the process. Now within the loop, we have a go-to step, and the go-to step simply goes to the following line. There's no real other option you can put in the go-to. It only skips to the next line. Now, one last detail that is specific to tabular data files. There's an option right here called line limit. Now, this normally wouldn't affect you. However, if you need to extract a very high number of detail lines, so if each of your source record has, say, more than 100 rows, you can limit this to 100 or 50 or 20 or whatever you want. The reason for this is when you add fields to a detail table, the more lines you have, the more it has to create entries in the detail table, and that can be pretty slow. So if you have 500 lines appearing and you add a field, it can take like a minute. So you want to avoid this. The default line limit of 100 should be fine. Note that this does not affect your output in the same way that the record limit doesn't affect your output. Every single line and every single record is always generated when you create your actual output. So for example, if I limit to 5 lines, it shows 5 lines in the tabular view, and it shows 5 detail lines in the table, but it will actually output all 19 when it actually generates your output, such as your invoice. And that's it for extracting data from a tabular file.